Right. I was asked to give a talk about privacy, and so this talk is going to be essentially sort of a summary of 20 years of privacy in terms of how the field has evolved, and some touching on some aspects of public policy, technology, design, and other kinds of things. And so I want to just sort of start out with a short story, which is this is what computers looked like when I was growing up. They had a keyboard, a mouse, a monitor, and they only came in one color, which was really ugly. But if you look at what computers look like today, it's really quite amazing. We have smartwatches, we have smart glasses, we have smart speakers, and yes, we actually really do have smart toilets, and they bring new meaning to the terms input and output. The interesting thing about this is that um, these kinds of new kinds of mobile technologies and sensing technologies enable us to do amazing things with respect to healthcare and sustainability and almost anything you can imagine. But at the same time, these same technologies are causing a lot of problems with respect to privacy. Here's examples of a few headlines from, the past few years. Your Samsung TV is eavesdropping on your private conversations. It turns out that there's a microphone there and it was being used for controls. So you could say things like next channel, louder, softer, and so on. But, it was actually not clear what kind of data was being sent back to Samsung. So was it always on, and is it always sending data back? This next headline, Airbnb refunds guest who found indoor cameras during his family's stay. This Washington Post article is actually about the faculty who's next door to me in the office. So his office was right next to mine, and his family had rented an Airbnb, and he had really young kids, and they were running around naked inside this house. And then, hey, he just noticed, is that a camera in the corner? And it turns out it was. And so this is actually something that was not clear to him. It was not disclosed anywhere in the Airbnb rental. The third one, priest outed via Grinder app highlights rampant data tracking. So Grinder is a dating app similar to Tinder, primarily targeting gay people. And what this one company did is they bought data from Grinder directly, people's location traces, and Grinder tried to de-anonymize, or they tried to anonymize the data. But what these people did when they bought the data is they just said, look for people who go to these churches and was also at this conference, which was a religious conference. And they were able to pinpoint people who were very likely, gay and also were priests. And so there's the headline news right there. And this last one, stalk within your own home. Woman says abusive ex used smart home technology against her. This is unfortunately something that's becoming increasingly common where, people live together. They might set up a smart home in terms of smart speakers, smart doorbells, and other kinds of technologies. But when they break up, people can still access those things and can still see logs of data, can still see when the person comes home and other kinds of things. So this is unfortunately, as I mentioned, is becoming increasingly common and really hard to manage. But what's interesting too about this is that there's now, in response to all these problems, new kinds of guidelines and regulations. So the one that you're probably all have heard of is this GDPR, the European Union's new law regarding privacy. This is the main reason why we're getting so many of these cookie notices on every website that we go to. But it also has other kinds of requirements as well too, talking about you have to disclose what kinds of data you're collecting from people. You have to make it easy for them to download it and so on. There's also the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. It's actually very similar to the GDPR, except now it's from California. And where California goes, sort of the rest of the United States goes as well, too. Because, a lot of these app developers don't want to make something that's specific just for California. They'd rather make it work for the entire country. And lastly, there's a lot of these new guidelines with respect to these app platforms too. So Google Play is the app store for Google, and they also have a lot of requirements. And if you don't follow those requirements and you don't comply with it, then they'll just kick your app off the app store. So these are some reasons why you should care about privacy, which is that, you pretty much have to now. In fact, let me underscore this by showing you some of things that have happened in terms of these new laws and regulations regarding privacy. Google pays nearly $392 million to settle a concern about location privacy. A flashlight app maker settles over FTC privacy allegations. I'm happy to say that my data actually helped with respect to this kind of settlement because we were showing that a lot of these kinds of apps were collecting too much data. France finds Clearview AI. So Clearview is this face recognition app, and as you can see, they were collecting a lot of data that they probably shouldn't have, and they got a lot of fines. And this last one, I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the talk, but this one is particularly interesting, where it's the Federal Trade Commission is the main kind of advocate for privacy, consumer privacy in the United States. They actually required a company to disgorge their data. So disgorgement basically means that they had to delete their algorithms and the data that they used to create those algorithms because it was found to have collected it in privacy insensitive manner. So it didn't comply with their own privacy policies. And so now this is actually a really serious concern for a lot of companies, because you can imagine that if you can't collect the data or if you have to delete it, that's going to cause a lot of problems. So what I want to talk about today, what I'm going to do is give you an overview of like what is privacy, then talk about why we should care about privacy, talk a little bit more about why privacy is really hard to help you understand the forces and the constraints that are on all the kinds of designs that we have. How do we design for privacy, and also a little bit of what I think is what's next for privacy. So what are some of these future research opportunities for people, and what are the things that might change in the future? Feel free to raise your hand or also ask questions in chat throughout. I do have the chat window open, so if you have any clarifications, please feel free to ask. Also, Vivek mentioned that there's this new book chapter. So here's a picture of the book, Mobile Sensing and Psychology. And so I have one of the chapters in there talking about privacy, but it's also a really great book. It talks lots of different kinds of things you might want to know all about mobile sensing, from some of the legal issues to some of the technical issues about anonymity, and also about how you use it for doing user studies too. Okay, so onto this first part. What is privacy? It actually turns out there's no single widely accepted definition of privacy. And this, you might be sort of surprised about this, but let me give you sort of an example of all the different kinds of ways that people talk about privacy. So back in the 1890s, the first sort of early proposed definition of privacy is the right to be let alone. And this is from some legal scholars, and they were worried about the widespread adoption of cameras, where people could take pictures of people at any time. Other researchers, mostly in sociology and social sciences, talk about boundary negotiation as another dimension of privacy, where you're talking with people, or you're talking or working with companies to try to figure out like what is acceptable to share, what's not acceptable to share, and so on. And this isn't always a formal kind of boundary or formal kind of interface too. It might be something as simple as, the kinds of clothes that you choose to wear and how you want to present yourself to the world. Right? So that's not something that, it's not like a interface where you have checkboxes and other kinds of things. It's actually more of a fluid kind of process as to how you interact with people in the everyday world. The European Union has the right to be forgotten. So search engines are now required to delete data for people who are not public figures after a certain time period if they make a request for it. There's also anonymity. So this is perhaps one of the most common kinds of, notions of privacy, but it might be hiding inside of a crowd. There's also contextual integrity. This is a more recent notion of privacy that's been espoused by a philosopher. She's now at Cornell Tech University. It's Helen Nissenbaum, and it's basically looking at, rather than looking at whether you should or should not share data, is trying to talk about the norms behind that, and also what's appropriate kinds of data flows. So rather than just sort of saying, never share data at all, or always share data, or so on, is trying to look at a more nuanced version of things, where it tries to take a lot of the context as to what's sort of normal and what's also appropriate as to whether you should be sharing this or not. And perhaps the funniest notion of privacy that I've heard is actually protection from other people. So you might remember the Berkeley naked guy. If any of you are old enough, back in the 90s, you might have heard about this guy he's called the naked guy because he went to class naked. And the city of Berkeley actually passed laws saying you had to wear clothes because they were trying to protect other people, so they didn't have to see this guy naked all the time. Right. So you can also imagine another form of this is when you're inside a movie theater and the movie theater asks people to silence their ringers, so that way you can, watch the movie undisturbed. Now, part of the reason that privacy is so complex, as you can see from all these various definitions, is because it's really about appropriate use of data across all these different kinds of relationships. So, family and friends, you can use a lot of this boundary negotiation and other kinds of, social back pressure to try to tell people these are things that are okay and these are things that are not okay. But that doesn't necessarily work for governments or hackers or strangers and so on. And so part of the reason that it's really complex is that we have so many different kinds of relationships so many different kinds of data that can be shared or not shared, and trying to manage all of these under a single umbrella definition just doesn't work. It's also useful to talk about security and privacy together. So here, the definition of security was originally confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It sort of has the convenient acronym of CIA. So confidentiality basically means that you're not sharing data that you don't want to be shared. Integrity means that the data is correct and it's also not been modified. And available means that you can always access it. So this would be an example of protection from denial of service attacks. And more recently, in part due to the Internet of Things, there's a lot more new kinds of properties that we might care about. So for example, physical safety, or also usability too. So making sure that people don't need PhDs to be able to understand what's going on with privacy and security. You'll note that I have a comment here that people sometimes will talk about privacy as a binary thing. So this system is secure or the system is not secure. I think that's actually the wrong way to think about it, because security is more like a process versus a binary state. That you need to maintain things, you need to train people who are using the system, and you need to make sure your systems are up to date. So that's what I mean by that. Security is more of a process. And I always think it's a red flag if someone just says this system is secure without really trying to describe, all the different kinds of social factors and organizational factors behind it. Now, with respect to privacy, security is necessary but not sufficient for privacy. And again, there's not a universal definition for it, but what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is just sort of use this really broad kind of outlook on it, which is that it's the appropriate use of sensitive data. Now, one kind of distinction that's also useful for privacy is differentiating between personal privacy and data privacy. Personal privacy is more about you and how you manage things with respect to other people and other organizations. So this might include things like, again, how you are dressed, how you talk, what you can do to manage, your inbox, or how you manage messages that come into you. Data privacy, in contrast, is more about how organizations handle all the data that they're collecting. So to give a really concrete example, on Facebook, the personal privacy might include things like what you disclose on Facebook. So the photos you upload, your profile, whether you want to, respond to a text message from a friend, and so on. But data privacy is more about how Facebook itself manages all the data that's there too. It's also worth saying that, systems can be secure, but not necessarily private. So again, Facebook is a great example of this. Facebook has pretty good security. They had a few data breaches, but obviously they're raising a lot of concerns about privacy because of appropriate use of data. So it's a little bit hard to disentangle security and privacy all the time. So for the most part in this talk, I'm going to try to talk about them a little bit together as well. Now, in terms of how to think about privacy and security, I find that a really particularly useful framework is this thing called the threat model, or also risk model. So threat model is a term that's really useful for security, but threat model sounds a little bit odd if you're talking about family and friends and other kinds of things. So that's why I also prefer risk model when it comes to privacy. But it's really looking at the same kinds of concepts. So for example, what are you trying to protect? And how important is it to you? So if you're trying to protect, for example, your social security number, then you need to ask, well, how important is it to you? Is it worth, $1,000 of protection? Is it worth $1 million of protection? And the same question can also be asked of an organization. If you're collecting lots of people's social security numbers, how important is that to you? And how much are you willing to spend to protect it? The next question you should also be thinking about with respect to these threat models and risk models is, who are you concerned about? So focusing primarily on privacy, you might be worried about family members. So, I talk to a lot of students, and sometimes, their parents have all these location trackers on them. And even at college, they're still checking where their kids are going, right? So that'd be an example of a risk model. Your parents don't necessarily mean harm to you, but they also might be overly intrusive, and it also might restrict your freedom. There's also another threat model known as honest but curious. So it's not someone who is going to intentionally cause you harm, but maybe they're just snooping around. So if any of you have younger siblings, that'd be a great example of honest but curious. They just want to know what you're up to, but they're not going to really cause harm. They might be, cause you embarrassment, but it's not going to cause you any kind of financial or, any kind of physical harm. But going on to some more serious examples, there's intimate partner violence. So again, going back to that smart home example I mentioned at the very beginning, these people who have lots of data about you, they might know your passwords, they might have access to a lot of these devices. This has actually been a growing area of research and a growing area of concern because there's been more examples of people using these smart technologies to stalk, their partners. And so it's causing a lot of kinds of problems. There's also governments, advertisers, stalkers, criminals. So as you can see, there's lots of different kinds of examples of who you might want to be concerned about. And lastly, how are they going to attack you? And so this might be, data breaches, it might be hidden cameras, microphones, and other kinds of things too. So the threat model is sort of like the beginning of thinking about privacy and security. But there's also other kinds of frameworks that I found really useful for privacy and security. So one is that you can prevent problems from happening, and the other one is you can detect and respond to problems after the fact. So with respect to prevention, some examples might be access control. So you might have to expressly say, yes, this person can access this data. We might have better programming tools and better operating systems that can also prevent data breaches. Or you might also have things like two-factor authentication, user training, and so on. On the other side, you also, when talking about detection and response, you might also have, for example, intrusion detection systems. So using some machine learning approaches to see, have people broken into my system? Another one, the third example I have there, is cameras in South Korea are actually required to have a loud sound. This one I find particularly interesting because uh, the reason for this is because there were a lot of people who were abusing these cameras and in their smartphones, taking pictures of people unawares, sometimes in vulnerable situations. So, for example, at the gym or in bathrooms or other kinds of places. And so South Korea has a law that says all these cameras have to make a loud sound when you take a picture. So this way, it makes it obvious to everybody around you that you're taking a picture, and so it makes it easier to find people who might be taking those pictures in those antisocial kind of circumstances. So normally here, if we were in person, I might ask people like, why might you choose one of these over the other? Why might you prevent, or why might you choose to detect and respond instead? So for people who are watching this asynchronously on YouTube, I would suggest pausing here and thinking about this for a second. But what I'm going to do is just go to that next slide to try to explain why you might choose one versus the other. So in the prevention case, let's call this the pessimistic case, where you're trying to prevent problems from happening. The main reason you might not choose prevention all the time is because it's actually hard to figure out all the cases beforehand. So if you have to work out every single case where you're trying to prevent bad guys or the potential threats or potential risks from happening, it can actually be really hard to enumerate every single case. So why you might choose detection and response, the more optimistic case, it's called optimistic because you're assuming that problems don't happen that often. And if they do, then you can quickly detect and respond to them. But it can actually be useful if these bad cases are rare and the cost is not that high. So to use an example with Wikipedia, there's a lot of people who would just make these really dumb edits on Wikipedia, but it's actually really easy to revert back to it, the previous version of it. So that way, the cost is actually not that high. With respect to computer security, optimistic cases is actually really important for things like hospitals, where access is incredibly important. So I've heard stories of, these storerooms in hospitals where there was a security code that was on the door, and someone actually had a post-it note as to what the security code was on the door. And the reason for that is because if you're in an emergency situation, you have to access all the medical supplies. And they felt like that was far more important to make sure that those medical supplies were always available than making sure that, to help prevent rather than preventing the potential for theft. So this is sort of a really clear example of a trade-off here, that they felt like access was much more important than, trying to minimize theft. Optimistic cases can also be really useful if trust is high. So, for example, inside of a family or inside of a department where people know each other and they actually feel like they can trust each other. Configuration costs can also be much lower for optimistic cases because you don't necessarily have to specify all this beforehand. And lastly, optimistic cases can be useful because you can't always prevent all privacy and security problems. So inevitably, there's going to be something that you miss. And so it's always useful to have better ways of trying to detect problems from happening. Now, in practice, the pessimistic and optimistic cases are not mutually exclusive. So what you'll often see is something that has a collection of pessimistic approaches and a collection of optimistic approaches, and then having some combination of them. And also, since I'm talking about this, I thought it'd be good to talk a slide aside about this, that this spectrum of pessimistic versus optimistic is actually pretty common in computer science. You'll see it in lots of different things like version control, networking, and data consistency as well, too. But you also see it in lots of other things in the real world. So during the pandemic, I've heard this really funny story about hiring where these people remotely interviewed this one person and they decided to hire them. And when this person started working, was joining their Zoom calls, they were all thinking, is this the same person we actually interviewed? It turns out it wasn't. It turns out that they had someone interview for them and they got the job. And you can think about, well, maybe we could put in mechanisms to help prevent this from ever happening, but it would actually have a high cost to try to vet every single person. And it's also fairly rare that people are going to have fake interviews. So this is, again, is sort of an example of a trade-off you have to consider is, what's the trade-offs, costs and benefits for trying to prevent a problem versus detecting and responding to it. Same thing with shoplifting. You can prevent some thefts or you can try to get people after the fact. And same thing with speeding. It's actually possible we could stick sensors all into our cars to prevent speeding from ever happening. With GPS, we sort of know where you are and what the speed limits are. But, they would actually have a fairly high cost and can also make it hard in case you have emergencies. So the sort of summary here is that this notion of pessimistic versus optimistic is a really useful kind of heuristic. Okay, next I want to talk about data privacy. So data privacy is basically, again, how organizations manage, collect, and use sensitive data. And usually data privacy is focused on this thing called PII, or personally identifiable information. So PII can be things like unique data like names and street addresses and so on, but it can also be other kinds of data that can be used to help identify you. So it might also include gender, race, tattoos you have, any clubs you're affiliated with, and so on. And data privacy is focused a lot about the rules around data use and privacy notices and other things. So to give more of a concrete notion of that, data privacy focuses a lot on something known as the Fair Information Practices. Sometimes you'll hear people call these the FIPS. And these are all ones that you're sort of familiar with because this is sort of the dominant regime of how we handle privacy today. So this includes things like notice and awareness. So that way you're telling people what data will be collected and making sure people are aware of that, giving people choice and consent about data collection, access and participation, so people can see, the data that's being collected about them, integrity, so that way you can actually see that the data is actually correct. Security means that, the data is kept secure, it's protected from unauthorized access. And there's also enforcement and redress. So if something goes wrong, that there's someone you can complain to. So data privacy tends to be procedure oriented. So did you follow this set of rules and do you check off all these boxes? So in this case, it's a little bit like IRBs that we fill out. And a lot of the laws that relate to privacy actually embody the fair information practices. So GDPR, HIPAA, Financial Privacy Act, and so on, they're all sort of variants of the fair information practices. But I'd like to contrast this to outcome-based approaches. So outcome-based approaches might be something like we're measuring the effectiveness of these privacy approaches and trying to see whether they work or not and trying to measure those. And you might also think of this sort of like the difference between procedure-based approaches for billing for healthcare. So these are the things that we gave you. Here is the surgical procedures we did for you and so on, versus outcome-based approaches, which is, are you better than you were 30 days ago? And, do you have better health and so on? So again, here, if we were in person, I would ask you the question, what are these trade-offs of procedures versus outcomes? Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, now would be a great time to pause and think about this question. But if we proceed on, the reason that we primarily do procedure-based approaches with respect to privacy is that it's actually much clearer as to what you should be doing, and it's easy to tell if you follow the steps. So in this case, it's a lot like IRB. Did you check off all these boxes? Did people give consent? Are you making sure that everyone's over 18 and so on? The problem with these procedure-based approaches is that it's actually not clear if it really helps privacy or not. So I think, I've yet to meet any single person that says that these GDPR cookie notices on websites are actually helpful. And it's also sort of questionable whether letting people export their data is really all that great for privacy either. You can also imagine that it also opens up sort of a potential attack vector for computer security as well. But then the reason we don't use outcome-based approaches for privacy is that it's actually really hard to measure privacy. We don't really have a lot of good definitions, as I talked about earlier, and it's really hard to measure. In fact, the only thing I know that we can easily measure right now is the level of anonymity. And yeah, you can also do surveys and ask people, how good do you think the privacy is and so on. But, it's actually not clear whether that's going to be really effective either. So this is why in a lot of these cases, we tend to default to the procedure-based approaches. And it's also the same thing with IRBs. The reason we do these procedure-based approaches for IRBs is because we don't really know what to measure for IRBs. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of what is privacy. Next, I want to talk a little bit about why I care about privacy, and this also includes some of the laws as well too. But in terms of why we might care about privacy, pragmatically, the big one is that people won't use the apps we create if people have high privacy concerns. So there was a really interesting Pew Research study back in 2015 showing that 60% of people chose not to install an app because of how much personal information it required. There's also lots of national and local laws as well too regarding privacy, and so you also want to make sure that you don't end up in the news for really bad reasons. So, for example, in the United States, we have privacy laws that are focused on highly specific sectors or demographics. So, for example, we have healthcare laws, that's HIPAA. We have financial privacy laws. We have laws about privacy for children. And we also have laws about video rentals. Now, you might notice that this seems a little bit odd. Healthcare, finance, and children seem like pretty big. Why do we have something about video rentals? So, in case you're wondering, this is actually sort of a funny story. Back in the late 1980s, you might remember there was a person named Judge Robert Bork. He was actually nominated to the Supreme Court. And during the nomination process, one entrepreneurial journalist started wondering, I wonder what this guy rents for videos. Of course, he was wondering whether, this judge rents salacious videos, of course. But what this journalist did is he went to where Judge Robert Bork lived and went to the local video store and said, hey, can I see what this guy rents? And the video store said, yeah, sure, okay, and shared it with him. So the story ends here by saying that, well, he wasn't really renting any kinds of salacious videos. But the funny part is that when this news story broke, people in Congress were so horrified, they passed a law in record time. In less than 24 hours from drafting it to passing it, they actually put together a law saying you can't disclose video rentals anymore. So, of course, now we know if you ever want to improve privacy, you got to find some kind of dirt on Congress people and they will fix the problem really fast. But in terms of other kinds of national and local laws, particularly important for people who are working on mobile sensing systems, different states and countries have different laws about two-party consent for recording audio. So one-party consent just means that, for example, I have to know that I'm recording video and I don't necessarily have to tell you that I am. Two-party consent means that everybody who's being recorded has to know that it's being recorded. The challenge, of course, here is that it's really unclear how this might apply to mobile sensing systems. These two-party consent laws were primarily in the context of phones. And of course, there's all the social media where people are being recorded without their consent as well. But it's still sort of something that is up in the air in terms of what the law says. So I just want to sort of caution you about that. Also want to come back to this notion of these fines and disgorgement of data by the Federal Trade Commission. Here's examples of some more of these fines. So mental health app faced a large fine for sharing private user data. So for any of you who are working in mental health, I should really clarify that these people were doing something really egregious, which is that they were sharing all this data with Snapchat and Facebook and other kinds of advertisers. So I seriously doubt any of you are going to be doing this, but I just sort of want to caution you that it has happened before where major fines happened. And also this next headline news, you can see, the DOJ settled with this Weight Watchers weight loss app about children's privacy and required them to delete all the data and they had to redo all their machine learning training as well. So also something to be careful of. Also, I wanted to give you sort of a really brief overview of some relevant laws if you're working on mobile sensing systems. So if you're working in healthcare apps, a lot of these healthcare apps, they may be regulated by HIPAA or by the FDA. And so this is actually one of the reasons why a lot of these apps that deal with healthcare are really styled as lifestyle or fitness apps, or they're classified in the app stores as lifestyle fitness, so they don't have to be regulated. So this is sort of like a workaround, but it also makes it so that you can't make certain kinds of claims as well too. If you're working with children under the age of 13, you also can't collect data on them on websites or on smartphone apps without the consent of their parents. So that was the one that got that previous Weight Watchers app in trouble. If you're working on any kind of mobile sensing app for education, FERPA is the relevant law here and actually governs what can and can't be disclosed to others. So if you're not in university, the basic way this works is, you can't really share much data about any of your students with other people. So even if a student's parents were to ask me, was my child in class? I can't tell them. I would just have to say, FERPA says I can't tell you this. So there's very minimal kind of data you can disclose to other people without more consent from the individual. You should also know that GDPR does require this thing called a data protection impact assessment if you have new projects that, as you can see the quote there, high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. Now, this also raises two big questions, which is what is a high risk? And also, how do you do this data protection impact assessment? Both of those are actually unclear right now. So again, if you're going to do a project that's over in Europe, I just want to sort of caution you about these, that there's a lot that's sort of, unclear right now, legally unclear. So what I would say here is the best thing to do is consult with a lawyer. But if you're doing research, then the main thing you really need to be worried about is just complying with the IRB. So that you should think of that as sort of like a minimum bar, though. Okay, so talked about why we should care about privacy. The next one is, why is privacy hard? Again, feel free to ask any questions over in chat. I also can't see any participants if you're raising your hand or not, but if you are, just go ahead and interrupt me too. Uh, why I wanted to talk about why privacy is hard is to help you understand constraints, forces, and possible solutions for privacy. And so by trying to talk about all the different reasons why privacy is hard, I think that you'll get a better sense as to what are the potential threats as well too. So one obvious reason why privacy is becoming harder is because technology is improving rapidly. So sensing is easier than it's ever been before. You can get click streams from all these websites really easily as well. Machine learning is becoming better than ever, and we can make all these amazing inferences. And data storage is also cheap too. So you can just get tons of data and analyze it. A related challenge is that there's really strong incentives for collecting data. So the main one is advertising, but there's also a really scary term I heard recently called post-purchase monetization. And so if you ever bought a smart TV within the past 2 or 3 years, you probably noticed that it's actually fairly cheap. But the reason some of these are extremely cheap is because this post-purchase monetization, which is that these smart TVs are so cheap because they're trying to collect data about you and your viewing habits and selling those to other people. In fact, this news article, as you can see right here on the slide, I found it really interesting because this is something that just happened, and it's convergence of both of these forces of improvements in technology as well as incentives for collecting data. There was a vending machine on a college campus in Canada that one college student found out that is actually using face recognition to try to collect data about who's buying stuff from the vending machine. And it was not clear at all that this vending machine was doing this. So it just shows to you that, how much easier it is to put all these sensing technologies inside a vending machine, and also how easy it is to collect all this data and using it for various reasons, for, trying to figure out demographics and all, but also to sell the data. Another reason why privacy is so hard is actually there's very little pushback from consumers. So one of the problems here is if you wanted to buy a webcam, for example, at an electronics store, you could look at the webcams, you could look at the prices, you could see their features, you could see whether the color is a good color for your house or not, and so on. But it's really hard to compare privacy and security. In fact, I saw this really interesting talk by this super hacker one time that spent a full month trying to figure out what data a webcam was sending out and where. It turns out it was sending a lot of data back to China, and who's trying to reverse engineer exactly what data was being sent. But it took this individual a whole month to just examine one single camera, right? And so what hope do any of us really have? for trying to understand that. And so this leads to something known as a market failure, where because people don't compare against privacy, the market doesn't do anything about it, and it just leads to sort of a suboptimal outcome for all of us. Another problem with respect to privacy is that there's a really heavy burden on all of us as end users. So each of you, if you want to manage your own privacy, you need to know about cookies, VPNs, trackers, permissions, and a whole bunch more. And it's just too much for any single person to really manage anymore. Yet another reason is that developers have to do a lot of work, but they have very little support or knowledge or tool support. So for example, one of the things that GDPR and CCPA say is users have the right to see and export their data. That's great, but now you as a developer have to implement that. There's data retention rules and the right to be forgotten. Okay, developers have to implement that. They also have to implement these new nutrition labels. I'll show you an example of that later on. They also have to do in-app notifications for smartphone apps. And that's just sort of a sample of the things they have to do. So they have to do a lot more than this as well, too. And again, there's just very little knowledge or support for doing it. Another challenge is it's actually very unclear what these best practices are. So for choice and consent, that's one of the fair information practices. What's the best way of actually offering choice? Right? It's unclear. And what happens if you are doing this on a smartwatch? So you have a very small interface. Or what happens if you're doing it on Alexa where there is no visual interface? For access and participation, what's the best way of doing this? How do you make it so people can see their data? Imagine that you're on an Alexa. How do you let people see their data? And also for notice awareness, typically it's privacy policies, but are they actually useful? The only time I know of when people read privacy policies is when I assign it as a homework. Nobody I've ever talked to, yeah, well, okay, that's not true because I talk to a lot of privacy advocates, but anyone outside of privacy that I talk to, no one reads these things. And here's a screenshot of the New York Times privacy policy a few years ago. Look how long this thing is, right? This would never work for IoT, especially devices with no screens. Right, so this is a really big challenge. We just don't have a good solution for this. Yet another reason why privacy is hard, the same data can be viewed as helpful and can also be viewed as harmful depending on the context of use. So on the left side is a screenshot of this app called Foursquare. It used to be pretty popular. What you could do is you could check into places and say, for example, I was at this school or I was at this university and so on. And if you became the person who checked in there the most, you could become the mayor. And sometimes people would give you discounts if you're the mayor of a shop. For example, if you were the #1 person at this ice cream shop, maybe you would get like a small discount. All right, so it was sort of a fun app, and it was actually sort of useful because people could also use it as a log of places they went. Unfortunately, what one person did on the right side, as you can see, is they took the exact same data from Foursquare, they filtered it out to look for women, and they got the pictures, the profiles of those women, and plotted it all on a map and turned it into an app called Girls Around Me. And so if you're feeling really creepy or skeezy about it, then that's good because it is sort of like a skeezy app. But the problem I'm trying to convey here is that it's the exact same data, right? But it's being used in just different ways. And so this is another reason why privacy is so hard because it really depends heavily on the context and on people's expectations. And so that's something that's really hard to design for and also something that we can't really computationally figure out very easily too. Another reason is that big data can also break privacy. So even if you're not sharing people's identity, you can still see patterns that can reveal data you might not want. So what happened is that there's this app called Strava, where it's sort of like this fitness app where you can keep track of, your training regimen, where you've been biking, where you've been jogging, and so on. And what happened is that Strava actually aggregated every person's data around the world and released a map of it. And it looks like they accidentally revealed where some military bases are, maybe a CIA black site, and so on. And so the reason for this is because people were jogging around, the airfield. And so this is yet another example of how big data can reveal patterns that you might not have even expected. There's also issue of scalability. So scalability is a computer science term. Well, it's not really just computer science, but we use it in computer science to talk about what happens when you grow from small numbers to really big numbers. And so the thing with scalability is that now you can actually have new classes of attacks you didn't have before. So here's a website called showdown.io. I think Shodan is this antagonist in a video game. I think it's called BioShock, if I recall correctly. But this is a search engine for Internet of Things. And let me show you an example of what this one person did. Here, you can type in Linux UPnP AV Tech. This is actually a webcam that has some kind of well-known password inside of it. So like it might be admin and admin. You can do a search for all these, and now you can actually break into them. And I remember several years ago when I first tried this website out, I was actually viewing these webcams of people over in like Malaysia and Thailand and other places. Like, wow, I felt like it was a superpower. It was also really creepy at the same time. It's like, well, it's actually easy to do this. So, this is actually something that has happened too. It turns out that the world's largest botnet with millions of these computer IP addresses was because someone actually found all these webcams that had default passwords, and he broke into it and formed this botnet, and was also trying to blackmail people too on this. So it turns out this was a student, he was an undergrad, amazingly, that did this, who's actually since reformed as well too. But has happened, and nowadays, with this kind of IoT search engines, you can actually find a lot of these vulnerabilities too. It's also worth pointing out scale also affects individuals. So imagine that you have multiple devices and apps and multiple user interfaces for managing your privacy. This is really overwhelming. And also, what happens once you get multiple notifications from dozens of devices? We humans are just not really, set up to really manage that. And there's no really good solutions for all of this too. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about designing for privacy. And the short story here is that there's a lot of ideas. There's some conventions and things that you have to do. But unfortunately, there's little settled research. It's things that's a lot of it is still in flux. But in terms of best practices, I mentioned the threat model already. And see the book chapter if you want a longer list of questions that you can be asking with respect to user interface design, the social context, organizational context, and technical issues. I also mentioned the optimistic versus pessimistic earlier. What I want to do is talk about this other design issue, which is defaults for privacy. So with respect to defaults for privacy, I want to use an example of caller ID. So when you call someone on your cell phone, then you can see who's calling you, and that's because of caller ID. Right? The challenge with designing caller ID is imagine if by default caller ID is off, then no one would ever use it because no one would ever remember to turn it on. And then the whole system, you've spent a lot of time and money designing it and building it, and it's sort of useless. So default off doesn't seem very useful. But if caller ID is default on, where everybody has it on by default, then you also need to be worried about problematic cases. So for example, domestic abuse. So maybe someone needs to hide and they need ways of protecting themselves. It's also worth pointing out most people don't change their default settings. And so you have to try to make sure that those default settings are also something that is good with respect to utility, but also good with respect to people's privacy. So to give like a concrete example, imagine you're designing an app like Strava. That was the fitness app that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so everyone has a profile. Who can see those profiles? And should those profiles by default be shared or not shared with everybody? And what information is on those profiles by default? And so this seems like a potentially simple question, but the challenge here is that there's going to be multiple of these decisions you have to make, and each of those decisions could have an outsized impact on privacy. But there's little research to help guide us. And so, we've seen lots of failures with Facebook and Google and other places where they made a small decision about this by, what's shared by default, and it caused lots of negative reactions to people. With respect to user interface design, there's a lot of conventions that you have to follow now. So I mentioned the nutrition labels. These are things you have to fill out on Apple App Store as well as Google Play if you're designing smartphone apps. And it just basically says what data is being used to track you, data linked to you, and so on. So it's trying to have a compact summary of privacy for individuals. So you as a developer would have to fill these out. So that's fairly straightforward now. Privacy policies, there's a lot of fairly standard kinds of ways of doing that now. In-app notifications. So you've all seen these if you use Android or iOS, where the first time the app is requesting data, it's going to say, this app wants to contact, or this app wants to access your contact list. Do you want to allow or not allow? So all these are required and enforced by respective app stores. So these are things that I think are mostly straightforward now. It's still a lot of effort, but we have pretty good idea of how to implement these. I also wanted to share some methods for designing for privacy. These are all sort of like research-based methods, but I want to share them because I thought they were quite interesting and gave a lot of insights about people's concerns about privacy. This one is talking about something called the personal audio loop. The idea is that imagine if everybody were carrying something where you could always rewind the conversation back about, say, 30 seconds or 5 minutes. So in case you forgot something, or in case you want someone gave you, say, for example, a phone number and you wanted to rewind and just get it again. So this can pose a lot of privacy concerns because people don't necessarily know that they're being recorded. So what these people did at Georgia Tech is they created this new approach called paratyping. The idea is that a person might be wearing this personal audio loop or a mock-up of it, and then they might be talking to you in the hallway. And at the end of this conversation, they would use this postcard kind of format and give you half of the postcard. So let me zoom in so you can see what it looks like. So for example, I would tear off the left side of it and I fill it out sort of like, again, this is like ESM for me, the experience sampling method for me. I just talked to so-and-so and this is what we talked about and so on. And I hand the right side of this to you. And the top part, as you can see, describes what this personal audio loop is. And the bottom half is sort of a quick survey that you can fill out. And then it's already pre-stamped, so you can just drop it off in the mailbox and then we get the data back. So this is actually a fairly clever way of trying to get people's kinds of privacy concerns in a very cheap way. And even before you sort of build a system, you can even test this out. So I think that's one thing that's really cool about it is that you can get potential privacy concerns early on and try to figure out how to mitigate those, again, before you spend like months trying to build the system. Speaking of ESM, people have also used ESM in other ways to try to understand people's privacy concerns. This is a really cool study that was done by a friend of mine, Sonny Consalvo, and other folks at Intel Research. They were trying to look at what location data people were willing to share, with whom, and under what conditions. And so what people did, what the researchers did is they first asked you to list a lot of your friends. And then you, over time, over the period of the study, you would receive fake location requests from those people. So it might be when you're at home, it might be when you're at work, during the day, during the evening, and so on. They also had a nightly voicemail diary, so you could you could add in some more details about what your rationale was for sharing or not sharing. They also had questionnaires and also interviews. And what they found out was that, asking who was asking was the most important kind of factor in influencing people's decision to share or not share, followed by why they wanted the information and what granularity would be most useful for them. So this was a really cool kind of study because it gave a lot of new insights about people's preferences for sharing their location data. There's another technique that I think is really interesting. It hasn't been sort of well explored for privacy, but it's a best practice for user interface design. This is known as Wizard of Oz prototyping. If you haven't seen this movie, unfortunately, I'm about to spoil it for you. But the idea behind Wizard of Oz is that you're faking all the interaction. Okay, and so there's a person behind the curtain that is actually controlling this really large kind of wizard, and they think that this wizard looks really scary, but in reality, it's really this small, humble kind of man who's controlling the wizard, and it's just faking everything too. And so the way you can use Wizard of Oz prototyping in smart systems is you might fake voice recognition. So, for example, someone might be speaking and you as the wizard, you would be typing in what they're saying for voice recognition and activating the commands that they wanted to activate. And you could also do the same thing with location data too. You might try to simulate people's location data, you as the wizard, as they're walking around campus or walking around a city, and try to simulate what kinds of things they would see and what the interaction would be. So I think this is going to actually be pretty cool because you might get a sense as to what people's potential privacy concerns are about location sensing or other kinds of sensors that are collecting data without, again, having to build the whole system. Because after you build the system, it's often really hard to change it or maybe even too late to change it too. So getting data early on in the design process can be really helpful. There's also these vignette studies too. So for example, you show scenarios to people and get their preferences or concerns. So for example, my colleagues and I, we gather a lot of data about people's expectations of data use in smartphone apps. We ask them about, how comfortable are you with Google Maps using location data? And then similarly, how comfortable are you with this blackjack game using your contact list? And so using a whole bunch of this kind of data collection, then we were able to build a simple model of people's privacy concerns. Some of my colleagues, they did work on trying to gather preferences about Internet of Things scenarios, looking at what kinds of data people are willing to share under what circumstances. And there's also other studies. This one was done at University of Chicago, talking about interviews with people about privacy in smart homes to try to get these people's concerns based on various scenarios. I also want to briefly mention these two techniques, lean privacy review and privacy speed dating. Again, these are focused on early stages of design where you can get feedback from people before you really build the system. For lean privacy review, we actually have a website and a tool that help you do this study if you want. The basic idea is that you enter in the product concept, you sort of type in a natural language description of this concept, and then you have some crowd workers on Mechanical Turk or on Prolific try to list what kinds of concerns they might have with those scenarios. And then you have another group of crowd workers rank which ones they think are the most important and the least important. And so what you can see in this visualization is the concerns that are really dark are the ones where people said they were most concerned about. Another kind of technique in user interface design is known as speed dating. The basic idea is you have concepts of these, a lot of concepts of user interfaces and applications, usually using cartoons, and asking people what they think about this. And so basically you're just trying to create lots of ideas and also try to get lots of feedback quickly. What we did, my colleagues and I did for privacy speed dating is asking people, does this privacy issue actually concern you? Is this something that, would actually affect you? And then we also talk about interventions and asking people if those issues would help address those concerns. So we did this in the context of smart homes and found out some pretty interesting results about this. So for example, rather than trying to have all these different kinds of controls about, whether the smartphone camera is on or Alexa's on, people wanted like really simple kinds of controls like, turning off the power to make sure the Alexa is really off. So one thought here, each of the methods I talked about, and in fact, every method we have for user interface design has trade-offs. So there's no best method. In fact, this is something that really bothers me in paper reviews too. So if I can rant for a second, because, whenever we have these papers, we talk about the method we use, and then, the reviewer will sometimes say, well, why didn't you use this method? Why didn't you use that method instead? It's like every method has trade-offs, right? And so there really is no best method. But what you can do is use a variety of methods to try to triangulate and try to see if there's consistent kinds of results. But to give an example of some of these trade-offs, if you're using surveys, then surveys tend to focus on what people say versus what they actually do, right? And so you might not actually get accurate data. Another issue with respect to some of these methods, if it's a far off futuristic scenario, some people might not be able to envision how that might actually fit into their lives. And so their behaviors of what they say right now might not actually match what they might do if they were really using the system for real. Also, people's expectations of privacy can change over time. I mean, if you told me 30 years ago, people would be sharing on a large site called Facebook, like what they ate for lunch and all the pictures of their kids and all these, clubbing and other kinds of stuff, I would say that's crazy, but that's the reality we're in right now. Okay. Also want to talk briefly about system design issues for privacy and then wrap up with future directions for privacy. In terms of handling sensitive data on mobile devices, there's a lot of frameworks that make it easy to build apps and data collection. So there's FUNF, Aware, mCerebrum, and other kinds of things that have probably come out. They have features like, doing ESM studies, getting sensitive sensor data, storing the data securely. But almost all these systems are for researchers, and so there's really limited support. So if you do want to use those, you might have to deal with a lot of these kinds of compatibility issues. Another technique that people have been looking at is local processing of sensitive data. So you might transform the data locally on your device. So for example, if you're getting microphone data, you might do the feature extraction and maybe any kind of processing there. And then the raw data might never be stored anywhere. So this is sort of an alternative to try to make it better for privacy. It's also worth pointing out re-identification of data is often surprisingly easy. So if you ever want to share the data with other kinds of research groups, then just stripping away identifiers is often insufficient. So to give like an example of this, I forgot what the exact number was. It's something like 80% of people can be uniquely identified based off of just zip code of where they work and where they live. So it is very identifiable if you just have those two pieces of data. I also want to briefly mention differential privacy. This is a technique that many of you have probably heard of. The basic idea behind differential privacy is that you add enough noise, for example, to a query, so that you can't tell if a given row of data, for example, a person, is in the data set or not in the data set. So you're trying to get protection because you don't know whether this person is in the data or not, but you're still trying to get a useful enough result for your query. And so one example of this is, if you're using the Chrome browser or if you're using iPhone, they do something known as local differential privacy, where they add noise inside of the data telemetry before it's sent to Apple or before it's sent to Google. A variant of this is known as global differential privacy, where you're adding noise when you're doing the query. So you've already collected all the data and the data is accurate, but now you have sort of a protection to the data set. So you have to go through this protection when you're doing a query, and then that adds the noise. It's still worth pointing out differential privacy is still an art as to how you best apply it. It's even though there's a lot of the mathematics behind it and it is fairly rigorous, the best way of applying it and figuring out the balance between privacy and actually accurate results is sort of a tough issue. And to give like a really concrete example of that, differential privacy is in use by the US Census data, or by the US Census for the 2020 census, but it's causing a lot of controversy because by adding noise, you can actually distort a lot of the results. So it might look like a small town has more people or much fewer people than might actually live inside of it. All right, to wrap up, talk a little bit about what's next for privacy. So one big issue is, can we do better than notice and consent? So notice and consent is the framework that we're living in today, where, again, all these websites and all these apps, they have to tell you, this is the data we're collecting, do you consent, and so on. It's way too much burden on end users. People can't remember all the things they consent to. And again, it just doesn't work for IoT because of all the different interfaces and the sheer scale of apps you might be using. So it's not clear what might be better, but I think we really need to think a lot more about this, and hopefully some philosophers, legal analysts, and technologists can come up with something better. We still need better tools for design, especially at early stage. So I mentioned some of the early kinds of ways of getting feedback. It'd be great if we can also get feedback from actual users versus experts. Right now, experts are sort of the main way where we sort of get feedback about potential privacy designs. But sometimes we forget about the people who actually use these systems. But how do you convey to everyday people what the systems might do? That's actually rather hard. Can we get better tools for developers? So I mentioned this before. I alluded to it. Developers have to do a lot of work, and it's not really clear what the immediate benefit is to them. So I actually have a separate talk about helping developers with privacy, focused on the last 10 years of my team's research on this. And then there's also AI and privacy. AI is just going to continue to feed this push for collecting a lot more data from people. And on the one hand, this data can enable us to do much better services, but it can also enable new kinds of abuses. So, with more data, you can infer a lot more about people. So there's already systems that can infer people's sexuality just based on, the people they know and the places they go. You could also imagine embarrassment if, some of these AI inferences come out at weird times. There's also the intimate partner violence I mentioned, new ways of monitoring, and also government surveillance. So, there's a lot of people in Western countries that are really concerned about it. And it looks like in some of these more authoritarian countries, a lot of surveillance is already happening too. So for all the young scholars out there, I think AI plus IoT privacy is actually a really good kind of research area because there's a lot that needs to be done there. Also, the most common question I often get is, how do we get companies to actually change their behaviors? Because it's really, really hard. Companies are strongly incentivized to collect lots of data. So I think that while these concerns are bigger than they've ever been before, regulations are also becoming stronger. So I meant, GDPR, CCPA, and so on. And in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission is a major point of leverage. So if you do work that can help the FTC, that can actually be hugely beneficial for privacy. And also, I discovered that journalists and third-party researchers, I would be one of these third-party researchers, shame is actually really effective as well, too. So on the bottom left, this picture here of Privacy Grade, this is a site that I used to host. We had to shut it down because it was just getting really old and I couldn't really maintain it anymore. But what we did is we assigned grades for privacy for a million different smartphone apps. And we found that some of these app developers actually changed their behaviors in response to what we did. The one on the bottom right, Please Rob Me, was a really cool site. It was every time someone posted data about a check-in or they posted a photo that had location data inside of it, they would get added to this Please Rob Me site, letting people, trying to raise people's awareness that, hey, you're sharing a lot of data, maybe accidentally, about where you are, and people might be able to use this to rob your house. So these are sort of examples of shame. And they, again, Please Rob Me also had positive influence on changing, Twitter's behavior and Instagram's behaviors about data sharing too. Here, I think it's really useful to think what other third-party tools can actually help you with respect to shame or with respect to the Federal Trade Commission. The last thing I want to talk about too is, again, getting companies to change. Transparency can also help with market forces. So, if you remember how I talked about if you want to buy a webcam, you can easily compare it based on the size, the price, the color, and other stuff. What if we could also make it easy for people to compare security and privacy too? And so some of my colleagues have been developing this concept known as the IoT nutrition label, which tries to summarize privacy and security issues of a new kind of device. And if these are posted on each of the boxes before you buy them, then people could actually start trying to do these kinds of comparisons. So another way to think about this too is if you're a young researcher, are there other ways to aid other kinds of forces so that we might improve privacy? So for example, social forces or market forces. So that way you don't have to address privacy directly, you can just do it indirectly and make it easier for all these other kinds of things to come into play. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of privacy. So wrapping up, if you are a researcher here, again, the main thing to take away from this is comply with your RB, but that's just sort of like minimum bar. Okay, so I gave you lots of different things as to what you might do to try to do better than that. If you're working on a product, comply with the platform, so iOS or Google Play, again, at minimum. But I would also ask you to consider worst case scenarios. So what happens if there's a data leak? What happens if you have stalkers on your platform? And also consider the golden rule as well, too. How would you want to be treated if you were using your own system? What kind of value can you offer to your end users? And how are you going to protect that data too? Um, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I've been working on privacy for over 20 years. When I first started, everything was really fuzzy. It was unclear how to proceed, and the laws were very sparse. But they are much better now. Even though the privacy challenges are bigger now, I'm actually more optimistic than ever because we do have more regulations and we have much better sense of how to do things now. So we are at this inflection point for privacy, but there's still lots more to do, and we could definitely use your help.